All right, so I won't take up too much time before we jump into the meeting, but there are just a couple things I wanted to mention before we get started. And primarily, I think this will probably be our last main like general like interest topic meeting of the semester. But now we're kind of getting to the end of the semester. We will be starting the election process because we do pick those in the spring. So all the officer positions will be open. And shortly we'll have a nomination period where you can just, if you're interested in running for one of those, or you know someone who you think would be good in one of those positions, you can nominate them. The nominations that will be anonymous as to who entered the nominee, and we'll probably have that run for maybe a week and a half, and then once we get all the nominations, then we will conduct the elections and have that via probably a online Google or Microsoft poll. Yeah, so just stay tuned for more of that information coming up on how to put in the nominations and then do the voting after it. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. And then we will, over the summer, we'll pretty much take a kind of a recess from these style of meetings. We might, if there's just a couple things, have a little meeting between there might be a meeting between the officers, depending on if there's something that needs to get done. And then I guess next fall, we'll just judge how things are, whether we come back virtual or try and meet in person, and exactly what sort of time frame, if we'll meet every month, twice a month, something like that. So just stay tuned for all of that. I don't know if any of the other executive committee members had anything else they wanted to add. If not, then I will turn it over to Kira to kind of introduce our guests that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to kind of cop out and ask them to introduce themselves, but I do want to thank you so much. I've always enjoyed doing art and have always been super interested in biology and science, and they've always kind of just been this ongoing intertwining interaction throughout my life. And so I wanted to think about medicine and art and how those are coming together. So I really appreciate our guests for taking the time. And so if you wouldn't mind starting with introducing yourselves and just kind of saying a bit about like what your role is at the university and what your interests are.
Do you want me to start, Kira?
That'd be great.
All right. So my name is Amal Shibli Rahal. I'm an endocrinologist here at the university, and I am an assistant dean for student affairs and curriculum. And in terms of arts, my interest is I like to paint, and I like primarily oil, painting with oil. I also like, which is, I don't know if that falls into the category of art, but I like to work with junk furniture and junk stuff and turn it into other cool things.
Evan, if you want to go.
Yeah, for sure. My name is Evan Economist. I'm a first-year medical student. I studied graphic design in undergrad, so a lot of the stuff that I do is like digital design, some digital drawing. I also like to just draw normally, and lately I've been drawing a lot on clothes, so that's kind of what I do in terms of art.
Wade.
Hi, I'm Wade Gutierrez. I'm a fifth-year MD PhD student in a cancer biology lab, same lab as Kiera. And I like to both collect art and then to draw, and I really like pen and ink. but yeah, been doing it for really most of my life in some way, shape, or form, and it's taken a different role in my life depending on the life stage. But right now, it's kind of an outlet. But then it's also served some purposes in helping to study or to get involved in different fields of medicine.
Wade, that was a great transition. So kind of the next question that I wanted to talk about is like, what role does art play in your life? And this is, originally we talked about this being more of a panel discussion, but we are a smaller group, so it can be a little bit more dynamic. So don't feel like you have to like sound off. So.
Yeah, I'd say similar to Wade, the role for art right now is kind of as an outlet. Being so busy with school, it's just something I can kind of use to decompress or kind of get away from things for a while. Yeah, that's definitely where I am like right now. But like you said, it changes depending on like what's kind of going on in my life. So hopefully this summer I have a little more time to kind of focus on it more, do something else with it. But right now it's definitely like a decompression kind of escape kind of deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I use it as a decompression too. I paint in the setting of a class I go to once a week for 2 hours with an instructor. So I don't paint as much at home, unless I did paint at home during the quarantine when I couldn't go to my class. But otherwise, it's those 2 hours in the atelier. It's amazing how for 2 hours you forget everything else and you just get so immersed into what color to mix with which other color to produce, which shade of whatever. I completely totally unplug, and it just amazes me. And it feels like when it's 8 o'clock and it's time to start like cleaning my brushes and packing my stuff, like you just plugged me back in, and I'm like, where am I? You know, like what's the next thing I need to worry about? Oh yes, I have to stop by the grocery store on my way home or something like this. I mean, I've loved art my whole life. I used to, to like painting and to color and paint and draw as a child. But at some point it kind of stalled. I stopped at a certain point and I never got more instruction, and it sort of just stayed there. More recently, a number of years ago, actually, my kids, I noticed that my kids are really good at drawing and they're drawn to colors. So I decided that I want to nurture this a bit more than what it got nurtured in me. So I signed them up for classes, and that's what got me back into classes. And then I learned the oil techniques. So I haven't used art my whole life, although I've loved it my whole life, but the last several years. My use of art in recent months has been, I'm trying to look at ways to use art to teach. So I'm trying to look at it in a different way, teaching observation skills, teaching physical examination, listening and seeing. So I'm trying to take a different approach to art lately.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And one of the things that I've been kind of pondering is using art as a form of communication, right? Like we're a group kind of focused on how can we more effectively communicate science? And so how can art be a tool for that?
For communicating science. Yeah, honestly, I've been thinking within the realm of teaching, I've been thinking more about using art as a way to communicate more like clinical diagnosis and empathy and some of the intangibles of medicine. Particularly, lately with the social justice issues becoming sort of a more visible or on everybody's mind, I've been looking at art and humanities as ways to foster these skills. So to teach science, but you know, when I looked at the questions that you sent last week, it got me thinking about, you know, how can art be used to teach science or to communicate science? And I think it can. I mean, when you look at the mess that the pandemic has been, and how people do not understand, to what level people do not understand medicine. Even some basic things like you wear a mask, not just to protect yourself, but to protect others. You know, some of the basic ideas, you know, some of the myths around the mRNA vaccines and, you know, all of that, it got me thinking, you know, like if these concepts were in movies and songs and, you know, on Netflix as part of a popular drama, I bet you people would have related much better to them and understood them much better. So really, I mean, thinking forward, I really think some of these concepts, you know, when science is in movie, it shouldn't just be, you know, science fiction and this like out of this world, you know, the, you know, unbelievable or weird stuff. It should be this stuff, you know, a pandemic that actually could happen. You know, some of these concepts, I really think they should be in that, in popular art, at least.
Yeah, I think I was thinking along the same lines. Like science can, I think, like stereotypically be kind of impersonal and cold, and I think that art provides like a way to kind of bring a lot more humanity into it. And yeah, this is obviously, this like past summer has been like a great opportunity for that, and I don't know if people have capitalized on it as maybe as like well as we could have, but it has been a great opportunity to kind of bring more humanity into something that, especially since it's been affecting so many people in so many different ways, like it's very easy to connect humanity in like a science to such like a scientific like problem.
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking off of what's been said, thinking about how I've seen art used to communicate science or scientific concepts. One of the anatomy and physiology class that I took as an undergrad was combined into one. And so it was one 8-hour undergrad course, which took obviously most of your semester, but was really great because you could really focus on it. And the instructor, when she developed the course, chose not to give students slides, and instead, or like, I mean, they were kind of like the truly bare minimum slides. So it'd be like a title and that'd be about it. And the rest of the space was for you to draw. And the thought was that even if your drawings aren't anatomically accurate, there's still something about having both a motor and visual and auditory component all in one to be able to solidify something in your brain. And so you'd end up with these anatomic drawings that looked like, you know, a 5-year-old did them, but you would remember and you would have this really great memory, and you'd show them to someone else and it wouldn't mean the same thing to them because they hadn't been the ones to do it. But if you were to draw, like, if you were to show them the finished product, it wouldn't necessarily communicate the idea that well. But if you were to walk them through and explain it as you redrew it to them, it would again have this really great effect. And I know that there have been some studies done looking at drawing things out for patients versus like showing them a nice infographic. And they're difficult studies to do, right? There, you have a lot of information that's being communicated and a lot of variables to account for. But I do find that that's a great means of using art. I was just talking to a guy the other day, and we were talking about one of the organ systems, and I drew it out, and gosh, this poor man's pelvis that I drew just looked atrocious. Like, I don't know, things were coming out of places that they shouldn't have been. But I hope, and I think just in the conversation, that having a visual and being able to go and really emphasize a part was a great means of communicating that. And so just thinking about how we can do this in a smaller scale. So many of us get asked at family gatherings what we do. And as scientists, I think it can be really difficult to bring it down from this like very intensive level that we think of it to a level of how do we communicate it to someone who doesn't really know what mRNA means. But I think that not being afraid to grab a napkin and a ballpoint pen and to draw something, even if it's not an accurate depiction of mRNA, I think that that can really help facilitate some of those conversations.
Wade, you kind of brought us on. I just wanted to get everyone's opinion on. So because of our science, like, it can be so complex, trying to make those type of images and portray that across to people who don't know the background. Do you think there's an easier way to do it or a more effective way? Because like you said, if we were to draw something, makes sense to us. No matter what it looks like, we can work it out in our heads. It's like that, right, that, and then try to walk someone through it. But there's usually so much detail and so many little things that just to try to make an art piece that conveys what we're trying to say without causing confusion. Do you think there's or do you all have like maybe an example or something in mind that you've tried to do where you take a complex idea and really convey it in a more simplistic manner?
I mean,
oh, go ahead, Dr. Shibley.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just gonna say, do you really need, you need to decide what level of detail you need to convey in that art, and does the listener need to know all those details? And that applies to any form of teaching or trying to convey a messages. Try to teach too much and you run the risk of teaching nothing, right?
And that's been one of the greatest examples of during the pandemic, was that I see a lot of people who got small amounts of knowledge that was correct, but they saw it in just the wrong way. And then they extrapolated on that in the wrong direction. So you have to take them back to the small piece, readjust it, and then say, this is how it goes. And that's, when you don't give some certain, I'm not quite sure where it is. There's certain small details that just have to be where someone says mRNA. Oh, that's like DNA. Oh, these vaccines are messing with our genes. Okay, so you were almost there. It's like, and you took it and like, we're mutating humans. That's not what we're doing. So let's backtrack it, and but then there's that level of complexity where someone who doesn't have any type of background or very little just doesn't, it gets too complex that they lose interest. I feel like that's what I've gotten from most of my friends and family who have tried to understand what's going on. They get to this point where they just don't know enough, and they're like, well, that's beyond me, so I'm gonna just compress what I have, and then they spin it a little wrong.
I think that is like kind of the advantage of art, is that like rather than like a picture or something like that, it's like showing reality. You get to edit and prioritize and kind of make sure that the information is condensed in a way that is like palatable for people that maybe aren't as like well versed as maybe we are.
Yeah, Evan, I was just thinking that that, like, not to take it too existentially here, but like explaining things in and of itself is an art form. And when you think about how artists are explaining a concept in their piece of art, like the art that I did that's in the art show is an example of pointillism. And so it's, if you're standing far away from it, you can see like my wife and I holding hands, but if you look super up close, it's just a bunch of pixels essentially. And those pixels definitely aren't accurate as far as like, she's not made up of black dots. But I had the freedom to choose like how many I wanted to put, how detailed I wanted to go to convey the overall message. And Cody, I think you brought up one of the like most obvious challenges with that is like, where do you essentially draw the line? How do you, if you oversimplify, like if I only drew one black dot, then no one would be like, wow, that's your wife. They'd be like, nice dot. But obviously, like you can go to the other extreme and have this like hyper realism drawing. I don't know if anyone else enjoys watching those on YouTube, where they end up looking like a picture at the end and you're just like, wow, that's amazing. But it's a really specific form of art. So yeah, figuring out how you, like where your audience is at. I think, so one of the schools that I interviewed at had me explain my research to them as though I were telling it to my grandmother. And that was one of the hardest questions I received as a med school applicant, was to distill it down. And so at the time I was doing cancer metabolism, and I thought it'd be better to err on the side of oversimplifying than undersimplifying. And so I said it was a lot like how cars need fuel, and a cell needs fuel, and kind of took it down that route.
I'd say that there's some bias there on people who have grandmothers that are biophysicists or biochemists.
Right. Yeah. For context, my grandmother,
she totally understands this. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. But I don't know that, I think most people, when you go to a presentation, most people don't end up walking away being like, wow, that was way too simplistic and too clear of a presentation. I'd say like 9 times out of 10, people walk away being like, they tried to explain too much, that's too much detail. And so I think if there's a way to incorporate, like, even if your art is really elementary, I think that you can use it, and it might actually help give you some boundaries, just in what you can actually draw out in that time.
I don't know if you guys have seen the little posters around, like, on any trail. I think it's all of Iowa now, but someone from, I think, is the health communication or risk communication department, but she created this really nice little infographic about COVID-19 trail etiquette. And it has these really cute little, like, I don't know, drawings or pictures that I think have been really effective. I didn't really think about this until now, but I think that it really has been effective in getting people to just be a little bit more considerate with how they use the trail. Like if there's someone passing them, they'll go off to the side or something like that. And I didn't really, think about it until now, but I think that is a way that someone used art to convey like health information and actually get people to do something without like raising their alarm flag of, of wherever it might go when someone says like wear a mask or do something like that. So I think that was a really effective way, at least in my individual experience.
Yeah, to go off of that, one thing that I've really enjoyed seeing as a form of art is the photo voice. And so this is a form of art that is, I'm not sure, it originated in like with some photographers all over the world. And basically the whole concept behind it is to portray a story of some social injustice or a story of a health inequity or a disease that people don't necessarily know or think about through photographic staging. And so like it will tell a story of like depression and how that impacts it through different photos. And like it's a really cool concept. And I only just recently learned about it before COVID, but then COVID hit. So then all the sessions that we're talking about it were kind of shut down, which is really unfortunate. But I thought it was a really cool way of expressing the media or expressing sort of health concerns and different diseases through photography.
I think this really comes back to an important theme that's been coming up, like this idea of empathy and humanity and our perception of what we're communicating and how we're communicating it, right? Like when you're giving a talk, you're able to simplify, but then people are able to ask questions and clarify. And maybe that isn't as readily available or apparent in ways to interact with art, where they can get like the artist's take on the piece itself, but like people are still interacting with art on their own level.
And really, whatever presentation you're giving is a form of art. Like, I mean, art can have like really broad or really specific definitions depending on the medium. But when you think about like trying to communicate a concept using visual aids, like that really is art. And I think so many times in science, what I've seen, like going to a conference or listening to different presentations, is that the presentation is viewed more like less in light of like, this is art. And I think it could really strengthen presentations regardless of the field, be it biomedical science or a different form of science, to view it as a form of art. What picture you choose does matter, where you put it on and how crammed your slide is, how many words are on your slide. These things really do matter. And so even if you're not someone who enjoys like going out and painting or drawing, with pen and ink, like as a scientist, you are tasked with informing and communicating your ideas, and you can do that through PowerPoint.
So I have kind of a little different question. I'd be curious. So I guess like in our jobs is in sort of science related fields, it takes a certain amount of just creativity to do sort of the day job. I'd be curious, those that are also do art on the side, do you see that as taking away some of like, I guess, the creative energy, or does it add to it? Is it sometimes, you know, maybe you have to use a lot of creativity in the day job and so there's less in the art, or I guess does it supplement and help each other?
I definitely think that I don't like view creativity as like a like expendable resource or anything like that. Like I think definitely like when I was studying like graphic design in college, I've like learned a lot about my creativity because like you're so focused on it. Like it's a very clear like manifestation of creativity, like making these things or whatever. And I kind of discovered that like the more like information that I was taking in from like more disparate resources, like that always helped me like have like different inspirations and stuff like that. And I think like figuring that on that side of things as like definitely translated over into science too. Like I've definitely realized like I've come up with ideas or just like thought about things differently from so many different areas, and just like having so many different sources of inspiration I think is like always a positive. And so I don't think that it's like exhausting or anything like that. And I think having this like such different interests has definitely like helped like me on the art side of things and on the science side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Evan. I don't necessarily spend a lot of my day doing research or thinking about research. So you guys do much more of that. But the equivalent for me would be, you know, when I'm teaching or when I'm doing administrative work or when I'm working with patients. And I find that the more art I consume and I do, the more I'm capable to approach those issues from different angles, and the more nuanced my, you know, like the more capable I am to read people and to read their reactions and to anticipate the reactions. So I see more in body language and attitudes and in words than I probably would have seen or heard if I was not working with art. I just feel it sharpens my attention to my other jobs.
I can definitely appreciate that. I'm not much of an art person. I don't really do art more of, I guess, the classical sense. But I love being able to draw out my pathways and my cellular interactions in a visual form, just so I can see it in my own head, or I can have it sit down and then work my way through it. That means I usually have my dry erase board chalked out with random pathways and, you know, trying to draw these interactions, what I think would happen. Because just reading about it or trying to just interpret data for it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me until I see it visually on something.
Yeah, but you don't have to paint or make sculptures to. I mean, you probably listen to music. You probably watch shows or theater or movies, and all of that is art in one way or another. And the more closely you watch those, I mean, the more present and engaged with whatever it is, whatever kind of art you're engaging with, you know, whether it's reading a book or a poem or watching a movie, but you're not doing it absent-minded. You're actually doing it and your brain is in it, you know, like you're doing it mindfully. You'll see that it will spill over other aspects of your life, you know, that kind of attention to nuances.
That brings up a good point. I was going to ask is, with science and the complexity, how do we make it more engaging without losing interest in it? Again, with that complexity, how do you make art that's related to science in a way, or do you guys have a certain way of going about, like, you get those ideas, those more complex ideas across to people that don't have a background or like?
I think that's an art in and out of itself, right? Because ultimately, so the consumption of science is at two levels, right? There's the scientist who needs to know every cellular and molecular mechanism and understand it, you know, into the minutest detail. But then there's the you know, your everyday consumer who's the public, and they're not going to understand it to that level of detail. Actually, I don't, like if you try to explain something in your area of research and every minutest detail to me, you lose me. So the question is, what does she know? What does she need to know so she can function reasonably well? So what's your goal from sharing science with the public? You want them to buy into the vaccine and get the vaccine, or you want them to understand the transmission mechanism of a virus, so then they actually wear their mask and keep social distancing, or whatever it is, you want them to understand how the statin, what benefit they get from the statin and how it works, so they actually take it. So what they need to know is you've got to decide, what exactly do I need them to know so they achieve the goal I have for them. They really don't need to understand the HMG CoA reductase, right? Pathway. If you try to go there, you lose them. But maybe they need to understand the role of inflammation and cholesterol in causing vascular deposits and plaques, and so really it's deciding what level. I mean, there are so many levels, and you want to think of science as a million levels down, and at what level do you need to stop for your particular audience, and then you design your art to just hit that.
One of the scarier things that I came across during the past year was you can see media that tries to hyper focus on things to get attention. And so when you're talking about like, what data do I show, or how do I present this? I would see articles that would hyper focus. So one example was an article that talked about how the vaccines were ineffective on Native Americans. I'm Native American. I have a lot of family and friends, all Native Americans, and this kind of spun out of control. I saw it between people, and I said, okay, I gotta look at this article because they cited a research article on it. I go through, and what they did was they picked out one line on one table that said Native American, it was like 38% effectiveness or something like that. But in that thing, it didn't talk about how like comorbidities had an effect, and those comorbidities were diabetes, heart disease, obesity, all of which are like are compounded on Native Americans. And it was talking about specifically full-blood Native Americans with no other races, and that's very rare among us anyway. Almost all of us. And when it came to mixed races, they were at 90% effective. So I was like trying to convey this across the same people who were trying to spread, like they're hiding stuff from us. They're not trying to. I was like, no. You like they went and just looked at one little line. If you go to this next table, it shows this, and it's. I feel like sometimes when you try to narrow things down, you can not only run the risk of people misinterpreting, but other people saying, oh, look, they're trying to cut things out. They're trying to keep things from you. And it's like, no, I'm trying to make it understandable. Like, and yeah, like I can see how you're reading it that way. And it seems weird, but like, trust me on this. And they're like, no, you're science and they're part of the government. So that's kind of like what I see a lot.
Yeah. I mean, and this is more than just explaining a table in an article, right? There's this whole social construct behind it, right? And the mistrust of government, mistrust of, so there's a whole other level that leads to that point, not just, just the one table or what have you. So that becomes more complex in the sense that you really have to understand sort of the social context of medicine and those situations, and to address it, to present it from that angle too.
I think also just realizing that like very little art is actually meant for mass consumption. Most art, it's meant for mass consumption in the sense that anyone can look at it. But the way I view a Picasso and the way someone who has studied Picasso's life and his works, the way we view it is going to be very different. There's going to be a depth of knowledge about it that I don't have, and an appreciation that I really won't fully grasp unless I know more. And that's okay. That's totally fine. And so I'm by no means defending the article that misrepresented data. That's a different thing in and of itself. But the comment that, someone might say, well, you're cutting things out, you're You're not giving the whole story. The reality is, like, for someone, that is a sufficient story. It makes me, I watch a lot of reviews of movies, and Marvel movies are incredibly successful movies, and they all follow this kind of cookie cutter formula that like a lot of people like, and a lot of people will go and see it because they follow this formula that has been refined and is down to a science. DC movies don't, and DC movies are hit and miss. Like, you have things like Joker that have like really widespread appeal, and you have other ones that people are like, no, not so much. And I think that it's just a really good illustration of like the audience and how that art has been tailored to a certain audience for a different purpose, for a certain purpose. And so I think that similarly, like as we're drawing, like I did my drawings for my wife and I, like they were to commemorate our engagement. It was something special for us. So that's who I tailored it to, not really to anyone else. Whereas some other artists do want to have like a mass appeal. And I think that that's an aspect of communicating an art that has to be taken into account as well.
So I have another question, kind of change the subject a little bit. So I'm not sure if you guys are aware of, I guess some programs, instead of being like STEM, they're like now the STEAM programs where art is being included in that. And I'll have to confess, I don't fully understand, I guess, the reasoning behind that. And I'm not necessarily against it. I'd just be curious what your thoughts are on that, and how that relates, and if you think it's a good, I guess, junction or joining of them.
Yeah, I probably can talk a little bit about this because it's been a topic of discussion within the realm of curriculum design for medical school. And that in recent years, there's been so much more focus on STEM, which I'm not saying it's not good, but it happened at the expense of humanities. So much so that if you look at, like universities and how they budget their departments, there's not enough budgeting that goes toward humanities, and the focus is more toward STEM related activities. If you look at schools, I was actually on a task force for the Iowa City Community School District looking at their social studies curriculum renewal. Like over the last couple of decades or so, so much budget has been cut out of it to be directed towards STEM. So really the expansion of STEM has happened at the expense of humanities, so much so that people are almost, kids are almost being directed away from humanities into STEM. So if we focus, for example, on the practice of medicine and how that has affected medicine, we have less students from humanities background coming into medicine. We have the less students from a science background who have had serious humanities coursework coming into medicine. And medicine over the last many years has become this business, right? You see more patients, you diagnose more disease, you prescribe more procedures or medicines, you bill more, and then you spend less time listening and feeling and, showing empathy and really relating to the human beings. And with that transition, the public in the last, 20, 30, 40 years has lost a lot of its trust in medicine. Because now we are perceived as a cold business, and the doctor is no more the hand holder. So people are starting to talk about, we're losing the spirit of medicine by this hyper focus on STEM, and it's not the hyper focus on STEM, it's actually the under focus on humanities. So, the idea is, can we keep STEM, but can we revive humanities? Because humanities are what gives us that extra dimension, not just in terms of empathy, but also in terms of fighting burnout, in terms of attentive listening, in terms of attention to detail, in terms of seeing the third dimension in things. So there's a lot of talk now about, you know, reintroducing humanities without dropping science. And I think that's probably, you know, I mean, I think it's probably affected more than medicine. It's probably affected everything. I mean, my son is starting to look at colleges, and like I'm a huge, you know, I'm very biased toward humanities, but I constantly find myself trying to direct him away from, anytime he brings up a major in humanities, I try to convince him that he needs to do science and maybe minor in humanities. And then I'm like, wait a minute, you know, I'm like, I'm contradicting myself here. So I think that's probably part of that reason. It's a big debate within the teaching of medicine curriculum design.
I know, sorry to keep talking about undergrad, but again, it was only like a couple of years ago for me. I studied science and studied art, and like there was almost no crossover between the two in terms of like the people that I saw in the buildings or like any of the curriculum, obviously. So this is like a link that I kind of sought out for myself. But it's something that's been like incredibly valuable to me. Like Dr. Hall just said, in terms of like empathy and just like skills and my creative thinking and just like my enjoyment of my experience at college, like it's incredibly rewarding. And like, I don't think that was accessible for a lot of people. Like, again, this is something that like I kind of sought out for myself, and making that more accessible, or just something that people would even consider in the first place, I think would be super beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people consider it fluff now, right? And it's like, it's not fluff. It actually, if every book you read, every poem you read, every painting you observe in detail, every piece of music that you really engage with, it's actually adding something to how your brain works and making you better at being whatever it is, an engineer or a doctor or what have you. And like, looking at, you know, reading between the lines, seeing the hidden dimensions of things.
I wonder if like the kind of disconnection has kind of fed into that lack of importance, because people don't have those experiences to link them themselves, and they feel like they're less important, and that's kind of like a cycle that kind of just feeds back into itself.
I really think it almost starts in schools. I mean, you know, the budgets for anything that is not science has been cut out. Teachers have less and less time, less and less money to do it, and it becomes more of a checkbox than an actual something that you truly engage with, and you do, and you see the relationship between how this works and how math works, or how physics works. Yeah, I mean, I see it when I like look at my kids studying, and it just feels like it's two different things. Like even down to the level of when they read a math problem, and I'm trying to tell them, you've got to read, like you've got to enter, like they don't know how to read between the lines, like how to make inferences, right? If it's not in a word on the sentence right there in capital letters, we don't see it. And I really think there's some unmeasurable nuance we're losing by losing arts and humanities.
Yeah, I'm a little bit biased on this. My undergrad was in psychology. And, you know, then I got my master's, I worked in immunology, now I'm in infectious diseases. So I find my thinking is a little bit off from a lot of my lab mates, and they're like, okay, I got this data, and part of me's like, so how do you think it works? Like, okay, how does this do it, instead of like, here's what it is, this is what it is. Like, I don't know. I find like a diverse background and a better understanding usually helps broaden everything overall, because you just have that different way of thinking, different way of seeing things that can just help find these same connections. And it's strange that we're putting more emphasis on the STEM fields and ignoring humanities, but at the same time, the job market says go to STEM if you want money. Yep. And everyone's like, okay, well, if you want a job, then like do that. Otherwise, you're going to be, you know, the artist that's just painting, you know, in your family's garage or something. That's, you know, the stereotype you just go with. And it's like, but there's a lot, like most of our civilization can be bounded on art and humanity themselves, and science just progresses that forward. Like,
yeah.
Yeah, so we're getting close on time here. Just as a final question, I guess, about recommendations for someone who's looking to get interested in exploring art.
Well, first find what you like to do and define it in an open-minded way. I mean, for me, because I'm so busy with my job and being a mom and, you know, all the different things I do, I mean, I knew what I like to do. I like to do things with my hands, you know, like kind of crafty stuff. And then painting was sort of something from my childhood. But I knew that I'm not gonna be able to teach myself this stuff just because I'm gonna prioritize cooking or laundry or whatever. So I kind of made myself enroll in a class that makes me accountable to doing it. But I think the first question is, what is it that gives you, I mean, what is it that gives you pleasure? So you've got to do some introspection and try to understand what really gets you into your zone. And then if you can't do it, that doesn't mean you can't focus on it, because you could approach it from other ways. So you could make your focus on interpreting it, or you know, playing with it in other ways. You know, so if you really love music but you're not good with an instrument, you know, it doesn't mean that you have no future in music, but maybe you need to look at it from, you know, the standpoint of more interpretation of music than making music, or, you know.
I think if we have time here, we have one question from Jules, and I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, or I can read it here. And that's, he asked if there was an opportunity to collaborate with an artist or group from the School of Art, what would you want to do with that kind of opportunity? Maybe how would you make use of that?
I would love to see how they can help me introduce programming into medical school courses. And actually, I'm working with the Office of Writing and Humanities to try to seek those collaborations.
What kind of programming?
Okay, so I have something we're working on right now, and I would like to see it happen. I would like for us to create a seminar, an elective seminar, like a 1-credit course, where students can engage with visual art and music. So art that is not writing, because we have the equivalent for that course in writing, you know, where they engage with poetry and you know, basically written art, to investigate, you know, their biases, their feelings, their own narratives, etc. I want to create something that's that uses visual and auditory, if that's a word, you know, like basically music, photography, any performance art, basically, to interpret the pieces, but also interpret them from the viewpoint of being a medical student, or you know, sort of a science type of student.
And then finally, I just wanted to point out that Arya had linked an article here in the chat about art and science from the publication Physics Today. So if any of you are curious on that, you can check that out.
Kind of a pragmatic answer to Jules' question. As a student who ends up giving presentations frequently, I would love to see some sort of a resource for scientists or for medical students that, if you need to have someone look over your presentation and kind of beautify it. I don't know that that's a thing, and that's probably our job. But or even just another set of eyes to be hey, not necessarily do it for you, but just to give you some feedback on visually, this is what would make it better. I think that could. So I'm helping make a men's health presentation right now to give to undergrad guys. And as I'm going through, I'm like, man, it would be so nice to have someone be like, you know what, you could just streamline this here, or like this would be like just to give recommendations on how to make it visually just cleaner. And I think that that could help if physicians would be willing to use it. I think that that could potentially be something that would just assist with communicating those ideas. If there were someone in that department who were willing, and I don't know how you'd get funding and stuff for that, but I think it'd be kind of a neat thing.
Let me see if there's anyone else has any more questions. If not, we can probably wrap this up. Cool. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, it was a really interesting discussion, I think. Yeah, and thanks Kira also for setting all that stuff up and asking.
Guys.
someone to come.